All right, learners, welcome back to Study Hall. Today we're diving deep into a fascinating document, America First Trade Policy. This is a memo straight from the White House, issued January 20th, 2025.
It's a primary source, a real glimpse behind the curtain of policymaking.
Have you ever wondered how these big decisions are made? Well, today we're going to find out. We'll be looking at trade deficits, potential tariffs, reviews of agreements like the USMCA, and even those economic relations with China.
Trade policy, it's something that affects everyone, not just economists.
So let's unpack this America First approach. What does it mean in the context of trade?
Well, the memo, it's interesting. It links trade policy directly to national security. It really emphasizes reducing our reliance on other countries for critical industries, and technologies.
So what you're saying is what we import and export, it could actually impact our ability to defend ourselves.
Exactly. You think about rare earth minerals, they're used in everything, from our smartphones to defense systems.
Yeah.
And then there's also the potential for economic leverage in geopolitical disputes.
Okay, so who is actually tasked with carrying out these directives?
Oh, the memo names some big players. We're talking secretaries of state, treasury, defense, commerce, homeland security, a whole team of heavy hitters.
And what are they looking at?
Well, they're directed to investigate trade deficits, review existing agreements like the USMCA, and even look into potential tariffs.
Okay, let's bring some of that down. Trade deficits, tariffs, these are terms we hear a lot. But what do they actually mean for, well, regular people like us?
Sure, a trade deficit. It basically means we're importing more than we're exporting. And tariffs, well, they're essentially taxes on imported goods.
So if the goal is America first, and we slap tariffs on imports, doesn't that mean things could get more expensive for consumers?
It's definitely a possibility. Proponents of tariffs, they argue that they protect American jobs, they protect American industries. But critics, well, they worry about potential trade wars and increased cost for those consumers.
Okay, so I'm seeing some alarm bells here. If the U.S. starts raising tariffs and other countries retaliate, does that lead to a global trade war? What would that even look like?
It's a valid concern. There's no easy answer. A trade war. It could involve escalating tariffs, restrictions on imports and exports, and just a general disruption of global trade flows.
Yeah, that doesn't sound good.
No, it rarely is. It's rarely a simple win-lose scenario. The goal, at least from the perspective of this memo, is to use these tools strategically, to create a more favorable landscape for American businesses and workers.
I see. But the memo, it goes beyond just tariffs, right? It mentions something about a new external revenue service, the ERS, to collect these tariffs. Why would they need a whole new agency for that?
That's where things get really interesting. The memo suggests creating a whole new agency just for tariffs.
Wow.
This signals a major potential shift in how the U.S. handles imports. We're talking potentially streamlining the collection of tariffs and the enforcement.
So a pretty big change. And speaking of big changes, the memo also calls for a review of the $800 duty-free de minimis exemption. Now, I know that sounds like jargon, but what does that mean for people who, let's say, love to shop online from international sellers?
Well, that exemption, it basically means you don't pay import duties on goods valued at $800 or less. It's been great for e-commerce, especially for those buying from, overseas sellers.
Yeah.
But the memo, it questions whether this exemption is costing the U.S. in lost revenue and maybe even, allowing counterfeit or dangerous products in more easily.
So if they lower that exemption, could that mean the end of scoring those amazing deals on international websites?
It's possible if the review leads to a lowering of that exemption. Those imported goods, they could get more expensive, and that's something to consider, especially for small businesses who rely on importing materials or goods.
Yeah, I can see how this gets tricky fast. You import one thing, and suddenly you're caught in this web of policies. But there's one more big player we haven't mentioned, China. The memo specifically calls out economic and trade relations with China. What's the focus there?
Well, the memo, it takes direct aim at China's trade practices. It calls for a review of the existing trade agreement with China to determine if they're upholding their end of the bargain.
And if they aren't?
Well, the memo also calls for investigations into potentially unfair trade practices by China, things like currency manipulation and intellectual property theft.
Hold on, can we break those down a bit? What exactly do those practices look like, and how do they affect American businesses?
Imagine a country printing extra money just to make their products cheaper than ours. That's currency manipulation, and it can seriously hurt American businesses.
So it feels like they're cheating the system. What about intellectual property theft?
That's the theft of trade secrets. Patents, copyrights, things American companies have invested time and money in to develop. When those are stolen, it undermines American innovation, and it can cost businesses billions.
So is this America First policy a way to crack down on those unfair practices?
The memo. It directs several agencies to investigate these issues and to recommend actions, which could involve imposing tariffs, filing complaints with the World Trade Organization, or even taking more, aggressive measures.
So a lot is on the table, and I'm starting to see how this policy could send ripples through the entire global trade system. But is this America First approach really the best way to protect American interests? Couldn't it backfire? Welcome back to Study Hall.
Picking up right where we left off, our deep dive into America First trade policy.
Last time we talked about how this policy links trade and national security, aims to put American interests first, but also how it could spark trade wars and maybe lead to some unintended consequences.
Yeah, and one of the biggest unknowns is how this new approach will reshape the global trade landscape.
Right, so if the U.S. shifts away from multilateral trade agreements and organizations like the World Trade Organization, what happens then? Does everything just, descend into chaos?
It's a question a lot of experts are thinking about. If the U.S. turns away from the WTO, it could signal a decline in its influence and maybe lead to a more, fragmented global trading system.
So instead of one big global trade club, we end up with a bunch of smaller, more exclusive deals.
Exactly. A shift from a globalized system to a more regionalized one, whether that's good or bad. Well, that's up for debate.
Okay, let's play devil's advocate for a second. Some might argue that breaking away from these big agreements gives the U.S. more freedom and flexibility to negotiate deals that are tailored to its interests.
That's one perspective. Proponents of this view argue that it allows the U.S. to be more nimble, more responsive to its own economic and strategic needs.
But couldn't that also lead to a kind of Wild West scenario where every country makes its own rules and there's less stability and predictability in the global market?
That's the other side of the coin. Critics worry about that. They worry it could lead to more trade barriers, more disputes, and ultimately harm the global economy.
So it's a trade-off. More control for the U.S.,
Right.
but potentially more instability for everyone. Speaking of trade-offs, let's talk about supply chains. The memo talks about reducing our reliance on foreign countries, especially for critical industries. But wouldn't that disrupt the intricate web of global supply chains that businesses rely on?
It would definitely have an impact. The memo emphasizes bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., or sourcing materials, from more, shall we say, friendly nations.
Which sounds good, but wouldn't that make everything more expensive? Isn't that a big part of why so much manufacturing is done overseas? Because it's cheaper.
It often comes down to cost. Labor and production costs are lower in a lot of developing countries. Makes it more economical to manufacture things overseas.
So if we start bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., wouldn't that mean higher prices for consumers?
It's a legitimate concern. The cost of goods could definitely go up, at least in the short term.
But I bet proponents of reshoring would say it's worth the extra cost.
Exactly. They'd say, look at the job creation in the U.S. Increase national security. You have these essential industries here at home, and potentially even higher quality goods.
But what about businesses that rely on imported materials? Wouldn't this policy make it harder for them to compete if their costs go up?
That's another potential downside. Higher costs for materials could squeeze American businesses, make them less competitive, both here and internationally.
And that could lead to job losses in those industries, right?
Yeah.
This seems like a real risk of unintended consequences.
It highlights the complexity. There's this delicate balance between protecting American interests and maintaining a healthy global trade system.
Okay, let's bring this down to earth for a second. Let's say I'm a small business owner. I make, handcrafted wooden toys. But I import some specialty wood from, say, Canada. How could this America First policy impact me?
Well, if the U.S. put tariffs on lumber from Canada, your costs would go up. You'd have to decide whether to absorb those costs, raise your prices, or find a new source for your wood, which might not be easy or cheap.
So this policy could put me in a tough spot, force me to make some tough decisions. That could really hurt my bottom line.
It shows how even small changes in trade policy can have a ripple effect across the whole economy, impacting everyone, businesses, and consumers.
Okay, we've talked about tariffs and disrupting those global supply chains. But the memo also targets unfair trade practices by other countries, specifically currency manipulation and intellectual property theft. We touched on these before.
Yeah.
But can we dive a little deeper? What kind of impact do these practices have on the U.S. economy?
Let's start with currency manipulation. When a country artificially lowers its currency's value, it makes their exports cheaper, more appealing on the global market. This puts American businesses at a disadvantage because their products suddenly seem more expensive.
So it's like playing a game, but the other team gets to change the rules.
It creates an uneven playing field, makes it harder for American companies to compete.
And what about intellectual property theft? How big of a problem is that? And who are the main offenders?
It's a major concern, especially with China. We're talking about the theft of trade secrets, patents, copyrights, the things American companies invest in. When those are stolen, it undermines American innovation, can cost businesses billions of dollars.
So how does America First address these practices?
The memo calls for investigations. It directs agencies to recommend actions. Could be tariffs, complaints to the World Trade Organization, or even more aggressive measures like sanctions.
Says the gloves are coming off.
The memo signals a more confrontational approach, a willingness to use a variety of tools to protect American interests.
But isn't there a risk that this could backfire? Couldn't these actions escalate tensions and maybe even lead to more conflict? And welcome back to Study Hall for the last part of our deep dive into America First trade policy. We've talked about potential trade wars, disruptions to supply chains, the impact on small businesses, and the threat of unfair trade practices.
We've really dug into how this policy could reshape global trade, maybe even leading to a more regionalized system with the U.S., taking the lead.
Right, but today I want to focus on the long-term implications. What kind of world are we creating if this policy really sets the tone for global trade?
The big question, right? One possible outcome: a world defined by competition and rivalry.
So instead of everyone working together, we're looking at every country for itself.
It's possible. If the U.S. puts its own interests first, it could trigger a chain reaction. Other countries might follow, adopt their own protectionist policies.
Wouldn't that be a step backward? Haven't we learned that cooperation and free trade are essential for growth and stability?
A lot of economists and policymakers would agree. They point to the prosperity after World War II, which many attribute to the expansion of global trade, and institutions like the WTO.
But this memo seemed to be pushing in the opposite direction.
It's definitely a shift away from globalization, and it raises questions about the U.S.'s role.
If the U.S. steps back from its leadership, who takes its place? What happens to the rules-based order we've had for so long?
Tough questions. Some argue that a more assertive U.S. is necessary, even if it means going it alone sometimes, to counter, the influence of countries like China.
So it's about maintaining American dominance.
That's a factor. Proponents of this view say a strong U.S. economy, plus strategic trade policies, are key to maintaining its standing and influence.
But could that also lead to more tension? Maybe even conflict?
There's always that risk, unintended consequences. If the U.S. seems like it's acting alone aggressively, it could alienate allies and fuel resentment.
So it's not just about economics. This policy could reshape geopolitics, too.
Exactly. Trade policy is never just about economics. It's tied to national security, foreign policy, a country's place in the world.
Okay, so we've talked about a more fragmented world, more competition. But are there any potential positives to this America First approach?
Well, one potential upside could be a renewed focus on domestic manufacturing, creating jobs here in the U.S. if the policy works. Brings back those manufacturing jobs, strengthens key industries. It could make the U.S. economy more resilient, more self-reliant.
So making America less dependent on other countries.
That's the idea. The memo stresses building up domestic industries, especially those that are critical for national security.
But doesn't that risk stifling innovation? If we're less engaged in global trade, less collaboration, aren't we also limiting our access to new ideas?
It's a good point. The flow of ideas and knowledge is often seen as a driver of innovation and growth. If the U.S. becomes too isolated, it could miss out.
So it's a balancing act. Promote domestic industries, but also encourage innovation and global collaboration.
A complex challenge. No easy answers. The best approach probably lies somewhere in the middle.
This all feels kind of overwhelming. How am I supposed to make sense of it all? Does my opinion even matter when we're talking about something as big as global trade?
You have more power than you think. As a citizen, as a consumer. Staying informed is the first step. Having these conversations, questioning assumptions, seeking different perspectives.
So educate ourselves.
Yeah.
And use that knowledge to make informed choices.
Exactly. And those choices matter. The products you buy, the companies you support, the policies you advocate for, they all send a message.
So this policy memo, Even though it seems far away, it could really impact us.
Trade policy isn't just some abstract idea. It's about our jobs, the things we buy, the prices we pay, the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up our deep dive into America First trade policy. We've explored the key parts of this policy, its potential pros and cons, and those long-term implications. We've challenged ourselves to think critically, to consider different viewpoints, and to recognize that even these big policy decisions can have a real impact on our lives.
It's complex, ever-evolving, no easy answers.
But by talking about it, asking tough questions, staying curious, we can all help shape the future of global trade.
So until next time, keep those minds sharp. And thanks for joining us in Study Hall.